Now that we have a reasonable understanding of energy metabolism, how energy is utilized in the system, let's see how we go about extracting energy through the process of cellular respiration, which of course is the extraction of energy from foods. Now, the important energy molecules that we need to understand is of course ATP, which is the energy currency. Another molecule, or two I should say, that we need to understand are electron carriers. Now, when we started this, we said that energy is found in the bonding that takes place between atoms to form molecules. That bonding involves electrons. Anytime you deal with electrons, you have to think of this as a potential bag of energy. In the same way, if you had a bunch of bouncing ping pong balls, you might consider that as a potential energy that you have in a bag of balls. So, when it comes to energy, we're looking at two things. One is the energy currency, which is ATP, and the other are electron carriers, NAD and FAD, which will basically gather up a bunch of electrons and hold them in place and eventually release the energy from them. To review our ATP, remember ATP is formed when chemical reactions occur that release energy. ADP, on your left, as you can see, will be converted to ATP when food is broken down like glucose and energy is released. So energy comes in, ADP comes in, grabs up that energy, and binds that phosphate group, as you can see on top, to form ATP. Now, if a system requires energy, that ATP will break down, a phosphate group is released, and energy will be coming out. So now you can get a better appreciation for how energy is stored and released in a given system. Now, when it comes to electron carriers, which is FAD and NAD, which we will focus on in a minute, we are dealing in a system that basically goes out and grabs up electrons. Remember, electrons are potential energy. This process is often referred to as an oxidation-reduction reaction. Oxidation is a loss of electrons. Reduction is a gain of electrons. Now, when you look at some iron rust, rust is an oxidation process, which is basically a process where electrons have been lost. So all of the electron carrier systems revolve oxidation reduction reactions. Let's see how oxidation reduction reactions work on electron carriers. As you can see, NAD can be converted to NADH. This is a reduction because the NAD is picking up electrons. Now, when NADH converts to NAD on the second part, that's oxidation because electrons have been lost, have been given off. So, electron carriers are basically systems that go out and grab up electrons and eventually release electrons, and when they do so, energy will be transferred. Eventually, you'll see that all these electrons will drive the formation of, you guessed it, ATP. This is an interesting schematic look as to how electron carriers work. Pretend you're a taxi cab driver, and the taxi cab is basically an NAD molecule. It is empty. 2 electrons come in, and suddenly it becomes loaded and it becomes NADH. As the taxi cab driver moves and drops off the 2 electrons, it becomes empty. It has become oxidized, and 2 electrons have left it. So you can see how, in the model below, how the electron oxidation reduction system works. So now let's look at the main point of this lecture, cellular respiration, which is basically the harvesting of energy. The overall formula is C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus oxygen, plus ADP, plus phosphate group gives us carbon dioxide, plus water, plus ATP. The whole purpose of cellular respiration is the production of ATP, as you can see to the right. Now let's back off for a second and think about what happens when respiration takes place. All of us, if I asked you what is respiration, you'll tell me respiration is breathing. Yes, we breathe. We breathe in oxygen, and then we breathe out carbon dioxide, as you can see to the right. But really, what happens in the meantime? What really happens is the oxygen goes into our blood system, runs towards the various cells that can metabolize glucose. And this takes place in the mitochondria of a cell. The oxygen will basically burn sugar. Your mitochondria is a factory for burning sugar. You burn that sugar with oxygen, and that energy is going to be released the same way you burn a log on a fire. That energy is going to be released partially as heat, but most of that energy is going to be captured into the ATP molecule. And what's the end product going to be? We breathe out carbon dioxide. So now when you think about respiration, sure, we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. But really what happens, which is more important, is we are taking that energy from glucose and converting it into ATP molecules, which is our energy currency and will be used in a variety of metabolic reactions. So let's look at respiration in the model to the right. Now, respiration is quite complex. It takes place in all cells. It takes place in the cytoplasm of a cell to start with. It goes into the mitochondrion, which has a variety of substructures that can carry out other chemical reactions. But basically, the schematic view of respiration, as you can see, can be broken down into 3 parts. Glycolysis, which is a linear metabolic pathway. In glycolysis, we take glucose and we break it down, and a little ATP is produced to the right. That glucose molecule has been broken down, gets converted into some other products, which now get thrown into the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is a circular metabolic pathway. Think of it as a wheel that goes round and round, and every time it goes around, it throws off some ATP and also some intermediary products. We'll talk about those products in a little bit. After the second metabolic pathway, the Krebs cycle, we now go to a third metabolic pathway, which is the electron transport chain. Now look what happens in the electron transport chain. A bunch of ATPs produced. In fact, 32 ATPs are produced. So in breaking down respiration, we can see that in glycolysis, 2 ATPs are produced. In the Krebs cycle, 2 more ATPs are produced. And finally, in the electron transport system, 32 ATPs are produced. Now, what drives this reaction to your left, as you can see, is oxygen. Oxygen comes into the electron transport system and grabs up all of those electrons that are coming in. Now let's look at this model again. Besides the ATP that's being produced, and we can see that glucose is being broken down into a organized process. We see that on the left there are a variety of electron carriers. NAD, more NAD, 6 NADs, 2 FADs. All of these are electron scavengers. What they're doing is grabbing up all the electrons they can get, and eventually what they do is they throw these electrons down a channeled or step, which is referred to as the electron transport chain, and this electron transport chain is able to basically suck out all of the energy and convert it into ATP. Now let's look at each of these metabolic pathways step by step in a little more detail. The first part of cellular respiration is glycolysis. Glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. It is a linear metabolic pathway. Glucose is broken down to a compound called pyruvic acid. The end result is we're going to get 2 ATPs and a bunch of electron carriers have filled themselves with electrons. As you can see, this is not an easy process to understand. But if you look carefully, here's the chemical reactions that occur in glycolysis. To start with, you can see that glucose, which is a 6 carbon molecule, glucose gets broken down in sequential steps. As this molecule gets broken down to, at the end, pyruvic acid, you can see some ATPs produced and some NADH is also produced, which of course are electron carriers. Now, why do we have all these little steps that go on from one to another to another to another, which I'm not going to ask you to memorize, but why do we have this organized metabolic process where one substrate leads to a product and it moves on, and every time this happens, the big glucose molecule gets broken down and energy is released. The reason a biological system works through this arduous process is that when you want to release energy, you want to do it in a nice, gradual fashion. Think of it. If you are standing in the bottom of a cliff and a lot of potential energy is present on the top of the cliff in a manner that you might, and a lot of energy is present on the top of a cliff in the form of a big boulder. That's potential energy. If you want to capture that energy, you can stand on the bottom of the cliff. That boulder can be pushed, and that boulder will come right on top of you and smash you into oblivion. This is exactly what would happen if I took my glucose and released all that energy all at once and expected the cell to utilize it. The cell cannot utilize that much energy all at once. It has to do it in one step after another step and so on. In other words, if that boulder came down the mountain gradually, you could have a series of pulleys that would capture all that energy sequentially, and you could make it much more efficient. So, when we release energy from glucose, we do it sequentially, and we do it through a system of metabolic chemical reactions. The first being glycolysis. Now catch your breath for a second, get some energy, and let's go on a little further here. Cellular respiration, second step, is the Krebs cycle. Now this takes place in the mighty mitochondria. This is a circular pathway where we take the pyruvic acid, modify it, and plug it into a circular pathway that leads into a lot of intermediary compounds that are important in a variety of chemical reactions that occur in an organism. Some ATP, as you can see, is also produced here. And in addition, lots of NADHs and FADHs are produced, which are electron carrier molecules loaded with potential energy. And a little carbon dioxide is produced here as well. So let's look at the complex Krebs cycle in the cellular step 2. If you look to the top, we have taken pyruvic acid. We've taken pyruvic acid and converted to a 2-carbon structure called acetyl coenzyme A. Now, it's not so important to know that this is acetyl coenzyme A, converts to citric acid, converts to alpha-ketoglutarate acid, and so on and so on and so on. But if you look carefully, you'll see that these molecules, these atoms, I should say, go through a series of reorganization. They go from acetyl coenzyme A to citric acid to alpha-ketoglutarate acid, and so on and so on, and it's a circular process. But what happens here is that as these chemical reactions occur in this circular metabolic wheel, lots and lots of electrons are thrown out. And when they're thrown out, you can see NAD is there to grab them and form NADH. NADH again, and then you have FADH and more NADHs. You're basically producing for yourself a bucket full of high energy electrons stored in these electron carriers. Now this is important because this bucket full of electrons will now be used in the next system to make ATP. So, in the third step of cellular respiration, we are going to be moving to the membranes that are present within the mitochondria. These membranes have a variety of proteins that can transfer electrons. They'll grab the electrons that have been captured by these electron carriers. So, electrons from the carriers are passed down a series of proteins that will shuffle the electrons. And the energy from the electrons will be grabbed by ADP and converted it to ATP. So you see, the whole purpose of this third step is to grab up the energy that has been captured by the NADHs and FADHs, which are electron carriers, and convert this energy into ATP. To drive all of this, of course, oxygen is necessary because the electrons have to go someplace, and the electrons end up into the oxygen molecule, forming, guess what? Water, H2O. So on this next slide, we can see how this process works. And I'm not going to go into super detail, but except to give you an appreciation for what is really happening here. Well, first of all, we're looking at a mitochondria, and the mitochondria have a series of membranes, and these membranes, as you can see, have embedded proteins. Now, these proteins are structured in a fashion that they can pull in electrons. As you can see, the electrons are coming in from the electron carriers. They are bounced in this chain from one protein to another one, and eventually these electrons, which is not clearly shown here, but maybe to the right, these electrons produce the net effect of producing ATP. Now, the ATP is actually produced by the molecule ATP synthase. Now, this is fairly complex because it works through a process of the process produces ATP, and it is the indirect result of electrons being shuffled down this chain. And this is probably all we need to know. But those of you who really are interested will notice that you are producing, in this process, you are producing lots and lots of protons on the outside of the membrane. This is produced by the shuffling of electrons. When these protons move through the protein called ATP synthase, it actually spins that proteins in such a fashion that energy is released and stored into ATP. Quite complex. So to summarize, we can see that in the energy respiration, glycolysis is the first step. That takes place within the cell cytoplasm. As we move towards the membrane, the product that's produced from glycolysis moves to drive the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle produces lots and lots of electron carriers that eventually move to the electron transport system. The electron transport system shuffles lots and lots of electrons down the membrane, which eventually ends up in the formation of ATP. So we have looked at energy in a way we have looked at energy and we have used the example of carbohydrates, breaking down carbohydrates and forming the various ATP that we form through the various processes of glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport system. But we eat other food as well. An organism will utilize proteins, fats, and so on. Now, no matter what macromolecule we utilize as a nutrient, each molecule can be broken down and somehow find their way into the system that we discussed. If you look at fats to the right, fats can be broken down to glycerol and fatty acids. And both of these products can find their way into the linear metabolic process and release their energy. Proteins can be broken down to amino acids, and the amino acids can be broken down into various intermediary products, which, as you can see, find their way into the linear metabolic pathway, all of them releasing energy and so on. So no matter what type of foods we eat, all of them find their way through the process that we discussed so far. Now, there's another important respiration that takes place where we do not have oxygen, referred to as anaerobic respiration. Remember, until now, at the end of everything, oxygen was the final acceptor of all those electrons that came down the electron transport system. But suppose you have no oxygen. When you have no oxygen, something else occurs. Look what happens when you don't have any oxygen. Glucose is broken down to glycolysis. In the glycolysis, we get pyruvic acid. Now, we have not entered the mitochondria. The pyruvic acid, because there's no oxygen present, gets converted to either alcohol, of course, produced by yeast, or lactic acid, produced when a runner, for example, is running and the energy is being produced, and eventually that individual becomes oxygen depleted, and therefore the oxygen cannot drive the pyruvic acid into the Krebs cycle. If the pyruvic acid cannot be driven into the Krebs cycle, an alternative pathway occurs and lactic acid is produced. Lactic acid is produced into the muscle, producing the various cramps and pains and so on. Of course, if the organism stops, allows the oxygen to come back into equilibrium, so to speak, then the pyruvic acid can continue into the process that we discussed before, and this anaerobic respiration stops to occur. So this is the process, basically, of fermentation. Alcohol production, lactic acid production. When milk goes bad, we have lactic acid production. When we want to produce beer, wine, and so on, we go through a process of fermentation where alcohol is produced. Okay, so what have we learned in the last 20 to 30 minutes? We have learned that when we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide, that little process is extremely complex. What we're doing is taking that oxygen, combining it with glucose, and basically releasing that energy from glucose in the same way we would if we were burning a log. But that energy is going to be captured through a series of metabolic pathways and is going to be captured into the energy currency called ATP. And ATP, of course, will be used in a variety of chemical reactions that are involved in metabolism, which is, of course, building or breaking molecules. Have a nice day. Have a nice day.